It was now time to start making a frame for the table, and I couldn't find anything in the workshop thick enough to use for the table legs. And I didn't really want to laminate pieces together, so I looked on Gumtree and found somebody selling 3 pieces of spruce. These were 10 inches by 2 inches and about 8 foot long, and I bought all 3 for £10. I cut these so that the height of the table would be around 74 centimetres high. Then I could rip this piece into 4 separate legs on the table saw with the fence set at 45mm, which was the thickness of the wood, so the legs would be 45mm square. I jointed and planed the legs too, so that they were all a consistent size. Next, I'd need some stretchers for in between the legs. I had 2 lengths of pine which I found in the streets. They were the sides from an old bed frame, and apparently the bed used to belong to somebody called Isabel. So thanks for the wood, Isabel, if you're watching. These pieces had cleats attached, so I unscrewed them and knocked the glue loose with a hammer. Later on, I'd reuse these pieces as cleats to attach the tabletop to the frame. I cut the stretchers roughly to size on the mitre saw, and I would cut them to the exact size later on. The pieces were a little bit warped, probably because I found them out in the rain, but I was confident that they were straight enough to use as stretchers between the table legs, and I used the jointer to square them up a little bit. Because the spruce legs were much paler in colour than the pine stretchers, I used a light oak stain rubbed in with an old t-shirt to get the colour to match the pine more closely, and also to match the chairs. Next, I chose which sides of each leg that I wanted facing outwards, putting the majority of the knots and imperfections in the wood facing inwards so they wouldn't be seen as much, and putting the nicer straight-grained faces outwards. I marked up the good faces with a tick and the less good faces with a cross. Then I marked up the shape of the stretchers onto the legs so that I could cut out a rebate joint into the legs for the stretchers to slot into. I used a Forstner bit to remove most of the material. And I made a little jig using a scrap of plywood to help guide each plunge of the Forstner bit. Then I could clean up the joints with a freshly sharpened chisel and check that each stretcher fits in snugly without being too tight. Then it was time to assemble the frame, so I'd need to cut the stretchers to the right length. I measured the tabletop, then cut the stretchers to the required length on the miter saw. I started to assemble the two shorter sides of the table frame. I applied wood glue to the rebate joints, slotted the stretcher in place, and then used a long bar clamp to hold it together. To make sure the legs were square to the stretcher, I checked with a framing square and made small adjustments to where the clamp was applying pressure until the legs were perfectly positioned. If the legs were splayed out, I could move the clamp pressure lower down the joint to bring them in. If the legs were angled inwards, I could move it higher up the joint to move them outwards. I then added a few screws and nails through the back of the joint just to add some extra strength while the glue set. I forgot to film that part, but I'll show you the joint later in the video. Next, I added the cleats back onto the longer stretchers with glue and screws. I would use these cleats later to attach the tabletop to the frame. I could then glue in the long stretchers to the pieces I'd already put together previously. I used my largest bar clamps for this. And used a framing square to check my legs were positioned right again. Then I could do the same on the other longer side, and you can see the screws I mentioned earlier that I used to strengthen the joint from the inside of the frame. I removed any glue squeeze out with a damp sponge. Then I checked that the frame was square, and unfortunately it wasn't quite. But the frame wasn't totally rigid, so I hoped that I could later fit the tabletop just by applying a bit of pressure in the right direction to square it off. Rather than worrying about it, I ate some crisps. Then I drilled pilot holes through the cleats ready for the screws to attach the top to the frame, and I countersunk the holes from underneath. Here you can see the nails I used on the inside of the joints. I started using screws, but I was worried about splitting the wood, so I quickly switched to nails. At this point I noticed that the legs were a little bit too dark in colour for the stretchers. So I made a weak mixture of the light oak stain that I'd used earlier, diluted with white spirit, and applied this to the stretchers to make the colour match better. With the glue dry on the frame, I could then fit the tabletop. But before fitting it, I stamped the underside with my name using this new rubber stamp that I ordered online. I then applied wood glue to the top of the frame and my girlfriend helped me to drop the top on in the right position. It actually fitted on top of the frame pretty easily despite the frame not being perfectly square. I could then screw the top to the frame from underneath, while applying downward pressure with my other hand to pull the top tightly onto the glue. Finally, I could then complete the finish for the table. I applied a second coat of Danish oil to the top, and a first and only coat of the oil onto the legs and the frame. I then sanded using a 600 grit paper with the oil still quite wet. I left it overnight and then I applied a third coat and again sanded while the oil was still wet with a 600 grit paper. The tabletop was really nice and smooth by this point. The finish looked really good, so I left it there with the oil. After it had dried out for a couple of days, I could then apply some brie wax. I mainly waxed the table to fill the nail holes and just provide a little bit of extra protection to the tabletop. I rubbed it in with a circular motion using a cotton t-shirt, left it to dry for a couple of hours and then buffed it with another old clean cotton t-shirt. That was the table finished and I think it looks really good with the chairs.